Hey guys, when you search for Bible-related stuff, virtually all the results are from Christian pastors and apologists.
Yeah, to find real biblical criticism, you need to dig down. Most people never even learn about all the scholarship out there, which debunks a lot of the evangelical claims.
Yeah, there's an entire well-funded industry of biased Christian content out there.
Our show tries to offer a counter-argument to them, but we rely on our listeners to keep the show going week after week. If you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project.
Thank you to all those supporting us. We hope you enjoy the show. I'm John.
And I'm Ben.
And this is the Skeptics Bible Project. We read the Bible
so you don't have to.
I don't care too much for preachers. I don't like to go to church. But I'd hate to meet St. Peter when my body leaves this earth.
Hey everyone, please enjoy John and my continuing conversation and reaction to Wesley Huff's appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience.
All right, Ben, let's continue on.
Particular rich soil that is man-made soil.
Oh, yes, I did know. I do know about that.
Combination of charcoal and bacteria.
Yeah.
And it's incredible.
Yeah.
And it's unbelievably fertile in terms of your ability to grow food on it. And they made it, and we don't know how they did it.
Yeah.
And it's man-made stuff.
Yeah.
Which is so bananas. It's like a giant chunk of this stuff that is all over the Amazon was made by people specifically to encourage the growth of plants.
I mean, this is why history gets me so excited.
It's like they made fertilizer. It's amazing. I'm like, yeah, like people have done cool things. Joe Rogan is learning about the world for the first time, apparently. I don't understand how any of this has to do with what Wes Huff's main thesis points are, though.
Yeah, it's just so wild. Wes should do a better job of trying to stay on topic of his actual area of expertise. It seems like this is really far afield, but this is the basic history of agriculture. This is what human beings do. They interact with the earth in order to grow food and manipulate the soil.
And if you're fascinated by it, that's great. There's a whole course of study you can do about it. It's not, I feel like Joe Rogan doesn't recognize that people, scientists and other people like researchers have been studying this stuff for a long time. I understand he's figuring it out for the first time, but he seems to have the attitude that nobody else has ever even heard about this stuff.
Yeah, that's what I think is frustrating. It's a genuine curiosity, it seems like, at least. It's stuff that he would learn if he studied the actual subject, but he's interested in a conspiratorial angle.
Yeah. You said genuine. I question the genuineness of it because I consider myself genuinely curious about a lot of things, and I think you are too, Ben. And so what do is like we research it. We Google it or whatever, and maybe nowadays we use ChatGPT and ask a bunch of questions or read Wikipedia, or if you're really curious, go and get some books and get them out of the library or download them, whatever, and study up on the subject. And I've done that about things that I'm interested in and curious about. Other people actually go to school for this. Joe Rogan doesn't strike me as someone that has done any of that for these things that are supposedly so fascinating to him. It's like his fascination extends only as far as one conversation where he hints at aliens being involved, and then he's just on to the next thing.
Yeah, it's weird because it seems like he's giving credit to the indigenous people that live in the rainforest that developed this way of farming and doing burning to mix the soil. But then he sort of goes conspiratorial and implies that those people could never develop that type of technology on their own, which the indigenous people knew a lot of things.
Yeah, it's totally insulting.
John and I have said before on the show, it's not that ancient people were dumber than we are. It's just the society that they lived in had a certain threshold of knowledge that they were working with and certain assumptions. If you can't see cells because you don't have the technology to see cells, then there's no reason you should necessarily be able to hypothesize cells.
Yeah. The way I would put it is we all stand on the shoulders of the previous generation. So obviously the linear nature of the way history works is the more time that goes on, the more discoveries that have happened. We have a brand new plateau that we can start on. The new generation can start with so much more knowledge than the ancients had. But you're right. They weren't any smarter or dumber than anyone that lives today. But yeah, the ancient alien stuff, I know a lot of Egyptians were really insulted that they said, oh, the ancient Egyptians couldn't actually build these structures. It must have been aliens. And there was historians, Egyptologists that were really offended by that have been studying this for a long time. Like, no, they absolutely could. And so it's actually doing them a huge disservice.
The ancient Hebrews, too, that built them.
Right. Forgot about that. How could I forget? Exodus. It doesn't actually say anything about the pyramids, though, in Exodus.
Yeah, it's one of those things that is inserted in the text, but never explicitly said, just like the name of the pharaoh. Yeah, there's a lot of problems. Well, not problems, but I mean, there's a lot of things that people put in as assumptions into the story because it's been told so many times. And there's a lot of problems that people read over because they've heard the story so many times.
So what you're saying is it's not really problems, but it's problem.
Yeah, it's not the specific problem that I just said, but there are other problems.
It's problematic.
It's like a Woody Allen film.
So interesting, too. I was watching something on YouTube yesterday about the Mayan culture and the Aztecs. I went on a deep dive when I started getting into getting ready for this. But when you think about how many people existed back then, and then Europeans come and everybody dies. Everybody dies of disease. And it's like, how many people died? Like millions? Millions of people died here? Millions of people died there? Like, holy shit. And you go through like the story of the collapse of the Mayan civilization, the collapse of the Aztec civilization, like the accounts that these priests had of visiting these Aztec markets and how incredible they were. These people from Rome who'd come to visit the Mayans, they're like, this is unbelievable, or the Aztecs rather. Like, this is unbelievable how sophisticated they are. And then
Gone.
Everybody's dead.
Dunzo.
You just gotta go, wow. How many times has this happened in history?
Yeah.
Where people have visited places and brought their cooties and killed off a giant swath of the population. And one of the things that they're discovering now in the Amazon, which is so fascinating, is through use of LiDAR. You know, discovering, like, oh my God, this is like all populated.
Yeah.
This whole thing was populated.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
The ground penetrating radar stuff.
And the trees and all the rainforest is mostly from man-made agriculture.
Yeah, that's wild.
Nut. And this is all recent that they're figuring this out.
Yeah.
Which is also so fascinating about history, is that it is a constant and never-ending search.
Yeah.
And that even in today, with as much information as we have, you can pick up your phone and ask them, you know, when was Nero born? To a lot of really fascinating questions, like the Olmecs or all these other civilizations, like who, where did they come from? Why do they look like this? Why did they make these big stone heads, you know, or Stonehenge? It's another one. Like, Jesus, what is this?
Yeah.
There's so many versions of that.
What's his point, though? Like, this is not really at all what Wes Huff's main point is.
Yeah, it's very schizophrenic. It doesn't address anything that Wes Huff is an expert in. Why he was doing a deep dive on the Amazon to prepare for this episode is very...
I want to be like, yes, Joe, like, history is fascinating. I totally agree with you.
It's like, I don't know why you don't apply that same logic about germs to the coronavirus that was going around.
I was thinking the same thing.
Earth,
I almost said something.
Killing millions of people. You're such a skeptic now of, like, the basic scientific point that you're making, but that was a little bit ironic.
Yeah.
This is what makes me sad. There's this level of looking at education, like college, amongst the, I wouldn't say the working class, but there's a certain segment that has sort of disdain for people that pursue higher education, or they're seen as elites, even though, like, most people are not going to, like, Harvard and Princeton and Stanford. They're just going to, like, a regular college. But to have a college degree, at least to a certain extent, was thought of as elite. There's a benefit to having that degree in that you study all of this stuff. You study basic science. You have to take a certain amount of science credits. You study ancient literature or global literature or American literature, you study Western civilization or ancient history or ancient Near Eastern history. There's an actual hunger for that knowledge out there, but then people are like, oh, I would rather listen to Joe Rogan tell me some things that he read off the back of a milk carton.
Right. I think that's my frustration is maybe it's not fair to Joe because it's fine to be fascinated with stuff, but it's really the size of the audience that he has that if you're actually interested in this stuff, why are you listening to Joe Rogan? There's way better sources out there where you're going to get actual information instead of a bias toward conspiracy theory. Amongst all of the stuff he says, there's always this like, no one understands how that's even possible, man. Like, no, like they do. I mean, there's definitely not aliens.
Yeah. There's always the need to be clickbaity or to go viral.
I mean, when I was 12, it was fun to think the same stuff. How did they even build the pyramids? It wasn't even possible. But it is possible. Humans built the pyramids. And I wonder, I don't know what Joe Rogan thinks about that specific thing, but there's always this tendency to look for a fantastical way to interpret the historical data that we have. It's just a conspiratorial way of thinking, and it doesn't really get to anywhere. When I was a kid, it was fascinating. It's like Indiana Jones. You grow up in a Christian household, and then you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, and you're like, oh man, maybe the Ark really is out there. Because it's a story that you really think is true, it becomes that much more fascinating. But then when you grow up and you realize that, okay, there's not like a magical ark out there, and Noah's Ark is not sitting on top of a mountain somewhere, and the Holy Grail is not out there, then those type of stories to me aren't fascinating at all anymore. They're just kind of lame. The Shroud of Turin, to me it's all boring because I don't think any of it has any truth to it at all. And then what actually is really fascinating is reading about genetics, reading about quantum mechanics, black holes, things on the edge of science that scientists still don't understand through the eyes of actual scientists that are really trying to get to the bottom of it. That stuff really fascinates me because it's almost like science fiction that's real. Like that's where the actual fascination is from, the edge of reality. But I'm not able to throw reality aside and embrace the fantastical viewpoints just because it's fun to think about. Because I don't think that there are ghosts, and I don't think there are aliens visiting us. And to me, it becomes not interesting at all to go down those roads just because I don't think it's true. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
It definitely makes sense. There's an urge to go along with consensus, and there's also sort of satisfaction in thinking that you know better than everyone else and having your own little conspiracy. So I can see like why people do this. They like create this little narrative, and they're the only ones that have figured it out, and they're part of a select few, and no one else can see it, and they're fighting some huge opponent that's trying to keep this secret. But that's just not a good principle epistemologically, like to when you're trying to figure out what is actually true.
But now the ones that are actually like that is like the actual science. I feel like that now. When I talk to people and they're like telling me all kinds of conspiracy theories, I'm like, if they only knew the secret truth that I had, the stuff that they teach in universities all over the world.
Yeah. And again, part of what we do here, it's much better than it was years ago as far as biblical scholarship being in the public sphere. But it was like people would go to church and never hear any of the stuff that we talk about on this show ever discussed. Dating of books or the question of authorship, possible interpolations, or contradictions in the Gospels, or even the more difficult passages like hating your mother and father or giving away all your belongings. These are not the things that are discussed in or covered in the regular mainstream church. So even though the majority of scholars would agree with all those things, it does feel like a little bit of a secret club. Although, again, it's gotten a lot better. There's more public resources that out there to get good biblical scholarship in the hands of the public.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
But it's still overwhelmingly people are going to hear about the Bible from the church or TikTok.
yeah, I mean, sometimes I'm too old school with the way I get media because I still watch cable TV. But it used to be, Ben, we've talked about this, the History Channel, they would have a question about something from the New Testament. And what do you know? They would bring on Bart Ehrman and they would talk about it, or they would bring on an actual scholar. But now, I think because of capitalism and they've realized they can make a lot more money if they basically embrace the fantastical, the supernatural or whatever. So a lot of these shows are giving much more credence that there's actual historical truth to the supernatural claims of the Bible. And not just with the Bible, they do it with everything. They got a lot of flack. I guess it was Discovery Channel, and they did a whole special on mermaids. And basically, it was like a documentary about mermaids. And there was, I think, a little disclaimer at the beginning, like, this is not real, this is fictional. But most people watching it just thought it was a real documentary about actual mermaids that they found. And yeah, your ratings are always going to be more when you're talking about aliens and mermaids. I think that's our frustration here, is that the information is out there. The discourse is being done in academia, and historians have talked about all these things. And that's where people should go to get their information. It's not a conspiracy. There's nothing wrong with academia. It's good. Those people are smarter than you are. They're smarter than I am. We should listen to them because they are the ones that have gone out, done the research, devoted their entire lives to getting this information so that they could educate us. And that's who we should listen to. We should not be listening to Wes Huff, and definitely should not be listening to Joe Rogan if you're actually going for real information. If you want to know about UFC, or if you just want to be entertained, fine. But if you're like, I'm getting my historical information from Joe Rogan, I think you have a problem. I could rant all day about this.
Yeah, I was thinking before, Joe Rogan really did build his audience and his reputation on Ultimate Fighting. So I think that these are just his side interests, and that's really his area of expertise. But he does have an audience that he could use for good. He could actually get good information out there, and he's big enough, I think we've even said this before, that he could have actual experts on and just ask them these questions that he has and get the actual answers about the pyramids in Egypt or the different agricultural practices of the indigenous people in the rainforest or station.
Yeah, but would he
and
lose
the
all his
role of-
audience? The reason he got this big is because he didn't have those people on.
But now he has them. I think this stuff is exciting for this audience or to consume because like they think that Rogan is telling us the truth. But they're not going to know the truth from, like, if a professor came on and told them the truth, they would, like, they're equally ignorant about what the conspiracy that Rogan is telling them and the actual historical fact.
Right.
So just tell them the historical fact. And I think that he has a responsibility just from an ethical standpoint of trying to bring good information to his audience.
He definitely has an ethical responsibility.
It's not going to happen.
I don't see it happening. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it's totally irresponsible to go on a show that has, I don't know how many millions of people listening to it, but it's a lot. And just to spout out nonsense or incorrect information. Misinformation, I think it's so dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I think this will be our ubiquitous Bart Ehrman reference. Although I think you mentioned it before, too. If you watch his podcast, he gets questions from his audience that he'll answer at the end through, like, email or whatever. And, like, there are often times that where he'll say, this is not my area of expertise. So even if he answers, he gives that qualification. Wes, if he was a genuine academic, would try to move the conversation back to stuff that he actually knows about. But
I
this
totally
is sort
agree.
of, I sort of do this too. Apologist attitude that they kind of know some about a lot of different things, so they're qualified to comment on the Reformation and also the early church and
No, he's not
Thomas Aquinas' theology and also biblical manuscripts from the
I mean,
ancient
if
world.
I was on this show right now with you, I was claiming to be a scholar of some kind, and maybe I had a degree, I would do exactly what Bart Ehrman does. And I would say, if something came up that was not in my area of expertise, like the Old Testament, I've heard Bart Ehrman say, well, I'm not a scholar of the Old Testament, but I have some thoughts. That's the way you should do it. Wes Huff is not actually a scholar in anything. He's a student. He has no degree, as far as I understand. He's definitely no PhD in this stuff.
Yeah, he's working on his either PhD or master's.
So he's basically like a student who has gained popularity because he says what a lot of Christians like. Basically, that's what it is. He's packaged his apologetics in such a popular way. So he's coming on before he even has his degree to be like, I'm an expert in this and that. And he absolutely should say, yeah, the thing you're talking about, Joe, that's really fascinating. That's not my area of expertise, but here's my thoughts on it. But what I've noticed with a lot of Christians, like when I was growing up, my pastor was like that. It was basically like, he's the expert on everything. No matter what the subject you're asking him, he speaks as if he has authority in every subject. And myself included would be like, wow, he's amazing. And now looking back, I'm like, wow, it was ridiculous that I ever listened to anything this guy said, because he was basically a con man. Why am I taking career advice or medical advice from this guy who does not have the credentials to offer that kind of stuff? If he was a responsible person, he would have said, well, I myself am not a doctor. What I'd recommend you do is go to a doctor and ask him about it. And that's not to say you can't give your opinion, but you should preface things with, I am not a professional in this field. And we do that on this show all the time. I think every single episode we say, we're not scholars. This is the information that we've gotten from these scholars, and we cite the people that we're talking about. That's completely fine. If Wes Huff did that, it would be okay. If Joe Rogan did that, it would be okay. But instead, and I think the problem we have with this is Wes Huff is on there as if he is the expert, and he's weighing in on everything across the board that he just is not even, he's not even really there to talk about, and he's definitely not knowledgeable on those subjects.
There's two things that are super annoying. First of all, pastors, broad spheres of knowledge. When you have an actual scholar, they're really concentrated on a very specific area because it takes a long time, even in that area, to study, to really know everything, to be well-versed and to be an expert. So your pastor may be like that when it comes to the Bible. He may even be like that when it comes to the Greek language. But the chances that he's like that when it comes to current events and ancient history and the history of the church, it's just very, very slim that he actually has that firm of a grasp. Now, he may read things and integrate it, but I don't think that you should take history lessons from a pastor or science lessons from a pastor. That's just not their job. That's not even a critique of Christianity per se. That should be really basic advice, that you shouldn't just take advice from people that have no idea what they're talking about.
And I also think, getting back to Wes Huff specifically here, people should be very skeptical of anybody that comes up with really easy to read infographics that are like trying to steer you. Scholars don't. Again, we've talked about Bart Ehrman. Let's talk about Robin Faith Walsh. Let's talk about other scholars that we like. None of them come up with infographic to show you how the Gospels are unreliable. They could come up with here's my website and you can download these PDFs showing the contradictions in the Bible with, little cartoon drawings and easy to read arrows pointing all over. They just don't do that because they're scholars, and their point is not to disprove the Bible. Their point is to study the New Testament and offer an education to people about how it was constructed, et cetera, et cetera. But Wes Huff clearly has this axe to grind. He has a very strong agenda here that he's pushing, which is, it's very similar to Ken Ham. Those of you that don't know Ken Ham, Answers in Genesis, teaching kids around the world that evolution is a lie and young earth creationism is true. He has no credentials, but he's a pastor, he's not a scientist, but yet he's been so much more influential than almost any other pastor I know on that particular subject. And unfortunately, he's probably more successful than scientists are. He has the Creation Museum. He has the Ark Encounter where you can go and walk through this life-size Noah's Ark, and it just tells people lies about history, about planet Earth, and humans walking with dinosaurs, and a global flood that covered the whole Earth, and a 7-day creation, and the Tower of Babel, and all these things that are just factually untrue, but yet kids around, especially America, are being brought there by their parents who think this stuff is true, and they're getting this alternate education. And it's so detrimental. It's so dangerous. And again, it's being led by people that don't know what they're talking about. They're not scientists. They don't have any expertise. I don't really know how to combat that. Ben, before the show, we were talking about this in other contexts, but it's just getting out of control. People are not listening to the experts. The people that know what they're talking about have no megaphone, and they're not being listened to. There's no money to be made to go out and talk about boring things. Oh, by the way, there is no aliens visiting Earth. By the way, human beings did not ride on dinosaurs. Yeah, maybe that's not as fun, but it's actually true, and that's what we should listen to. So I don't know how to combat that.
Yeah, I don't want to discourage you more, but I did see on Twitter, or X, what was formerly known as Twitter, earlier today that it was either the Answers in Genesis or Ken Ham. They actually calculated how many animals were on the ark.
Right.
So it was like 4,955 or something. Like they had it down to the number of animals. Pretty insane.
I mean, we talked about it once, so we should do maybe a series on creation or just the ark in general. But there is what I think is a hilarious video of Bill Nye. For those of you who don't know, Bill Nye, the science guy, science educator. I don't even know what his credentials are, so I don't want to contradict myself here that we should all be listening to Bill Nye. Anyway, there's a video where he debated Ken Ham about creationism, I guess. And before the debate, he and Ken Ham went walking through the Ark Encounter. And it's really fascinating because they're walking through and Bill Nye's looking at these exhibits and there's people around, like fans of Ken Ham and young earth creationists and families and kids. And Bill Nye was basically walking around like, the exhibit is wrong. Don't listen to this. And people are trying to argue with him and debate with him, and it's just so sad to see.
That's just your presupposition, mate.
Yeah, with your Ken Ham impression. Were you there?
Yeah, I was going to make fun of Wes Huff being a glorified infographer also, but you beat me to the punch.
Well, you would have done a better job than I did. I just think you should be a little bit suspect when people are giving you these little cartoons to steer you toward their biased point.
Yeah, the other thing that I'm going to predict, maybe I'm remembering listening to this previously, but I think that Wes is going to do the other thing that I wanted to complain about, which is the apologist pivot, where any subject is like a way to talk about apologetics. So he's going to be like, yeah, germ theory is crazy. Like, have you ever thought about how there must be a designer? So We'll see if that happens. That's my prediction.
I think it's probably a good one. We have a long way to go. Let's continue.
The search for our origins is one of the most human endeavors. One of the most, because to know that we are particularly unique. We're so different. We stand out from every other animal on this planet. And there's this crazy, wild war of biology where life is just eating life all around us. And we just got to some crazy place that far beyond any other creature that's on this planet.
Yeah.
And we did it in a bunch of different ways. We did it in a bunch of different ways all over the place with different scribbles and different icons and different gods and different things. And we're all wondering, like, which one, where did it start? What was the origin of all this? Like, what was the need to write these things down? What purpose did it serve to have these myths and legends and stories? Like, was it just to keep society together, or was it to retell a very important story that was a very unique thing that happened at the dawn of time?
And that's why you see, I mean, the literary literary comparison of ancient Near Eastern origin stories is like a really interesting thing to do. Because when you look at something like the Enuma Elish, which was the Babylonian creation story, and then you look at something like Genesis chapter 1, there are obvious crossovers with, like I said before, these ancient Near Eastern conventions. Mm-hmm. But then you can see that the author of Genesis is making these points that are actually rebutting something like the origin stories of the surrounding cultures that largely believe that matter is like eternal and the gods come out of the created world, and that there's this narrative of the battle that takes place where some gods fight against other gods, and the world around us that we see and like human beings are the end result of this battle. And so they would read this on every Babylonian New Year, and one of the main themes was basically that, like, it's all chance. It's all a random mistake. You were created without purpose and intention because Tiamat gets destroyed, and she's the god that you come from. And then you read Genesis chapter 1, and it says, in the beginning God creates the heavens and the earth, and he makes it good. And there's this idea that, like, that's countercultural in the idea that the Babylonians did not think that the world was good. And that, like, at the end of every refrain, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, and then it's very good at the end. And that humanity in particular is created in the image of God. Like, that's a very, not just like kings, which a lot of ancient Near Eastern cultures believe, that kings were created in the image of God, but that humanity in general is created in the image of God. And this idea of the Imago Dei, that that's why you're different. Like, why are you different from all the animals?
Right.
Because you're given something that...
I mean, I just knew exactly where he was going to go with it.
Yeah, I don't have huge disagreements broadly with what Wes is saying. We know that the Genesis accounts, plural, we've talked about it a little bit earlier, I think, when he mentioned it, but are riffing and bouncing types off of the Babylonian myth and other ancient Near Eastern myths. I don't think that he's right about creation from nothing, because I don't think that the Bible has creation from nothing. That the Bible shows Yahweh over the chaotic waters, and he starts drawing land out of the waters. And then in the other account, there's dry, arid land that Yahweh plants a garden. So this idea of creation ex nihilo is like theological, but I don't think it's actually in the text. So that would be one point that I would kind of push back on. And it's important to think of the reason for these differences. So their cultural critique, the motifs of the Canaanite people around them and the Babylonians that came and conquered them, and the Assyrians that played a part in conflicts with them, constructing this Bible to be critical of those ideas, but also show that their God was superior to those other people's gods. And then the other thing is, Wes says, the idea that God creates gods. I know he's talking about Genesis, but if you go to other places like Psalm, where Yahweh is assigning the nations to the various deities, sons of God, you can make the case that there are multiple deities and Yahweh is just at the head of the pantheon. So he's doing an extremely theological reading from a Christian perspective of the Genesis story that I would say first we should read as much as we can from the Jewish perspective, or try to reconstruct the history of when the text was actually put together and the reason that it was put together. And then I also just think Joe Rogan's point of asking where these stories come from, well, it's pretty obvious, and we've said this before too. Men are afraid of snakes, and snakes bite people in the heel, and they crawl on the ground. Snakes also appear in some of these other ancient myths. So explaining a natural phenomena, and you're also creating a ancient myth.
They explaining a natural phenomena again. If I was actually a scholar, an expert, there's a word for that. There's a word that historians use to explain that phenomenon, where, like the story of Lot, where Lot's wife is turned into a pillar of salt. That explains why there are these pillars of salt around the Dead Sea. God turned people into pillars of salt. That's just one example, but there's many examples of this, not just in the Bible, but throughout ancient literature. But what I take from what Wes Huff is doing is Joe Rogan is speaking broadly. I didn't really understand what his point was, other than, there's all this like ancient stuff and writings, and it's just like amazing. Like, I didn't understand what he was getting at. And what Wes Huff is going to do is say, oh yeah, there are other creation myths, etc. But let me explain to you why Genesis is the real one. These other ones are just derivative. Even if they came first, it's still derivative of the original story, which predates the writing of the Bible.
Jamie, pull up my infograph.
Yeah, so that's again what my frustration is that like Joe Rogan here is trying to talk more broadly about the fascination of the origins of humanity, and Wes Huff always steering it right back. Let me get back to show you why literal young earth creationism is the answer to all of this. And I don't know if Joe Rogan recognizes what Wes Huff is doing. We recognize it because we're in that world. Like, we came out of like fundamentalist Christian world, so we see exactly, and we know apologists, and we know that he is an apologist. I don't think Joe Rogan even knows that Wes Huff is an apologist. I don't know if he knows what an apologist is, but even if he does, I don't think he realizes what Wes Huff is doing here. Joe Rogan basically has a pastor on his show that's trying to convince him to become like a conservative, church-going Christian. That's what Wes Huff wants. That's what Wes Huff wants everyone to do. He's on this show almost from this different perspective of some kind of expert on history. So that's what I think my frustration is when I hear this. So Wes Huff is going to say, like, all this stuff is fascinating, but let me steer you back to conservative, like, church-going Christianity. All my answers are going to steer you right back in that direction.
Yeah, that's what I think is the apologist pivot. Super annoying, because everything has to pivot back to some sort of apology. This would be like Matthew McConaughey reading Lee Strobel or something.
Yeah, if only that happened.
All right.
Well, you should explain.
So there's photos of Matthew McConaughey reading Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ,
right,
which is a book that we haven't done an explicit review of, but we've definitely criticized a few times.
I mean, we did Josh McDowell's, like, I don't know how many, like 17 episodes
Yeah.
on like
It's a lot of
breaking
overlap,
down
I think.
Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ, which we talk about a lot in that series, is another book that basically does the exact same thing that Josh McDowell is doing.
Exemplifies of a unique quality, and then the ancient Near Eastern cultures that believe that the planets are gods, and that the sea is a god, and that Genesis chapter 1 looks at that, and it kind of subverts the expectations of the day in getting to this ultimate question of why are we here? What are we supposed to do while we're here, and how do we get out of here? It says that, no, there's purpose, there's meaning.
Basically, we're pausing now every 2 seconds, and we have like 5 hours to go, so this is going to not be good. But let me just say this. I'm a little bit offended. I don't want to say offended, but it's a little frustrating what Wes Huff just did there. Because again, he always insults the other culture's beliefs. He's like, these other cultures basically say like the planets are gods and these other things are gods. And like Christianity, like what the Genesis does is subverts all that. And no, that's not actually true. Genesis does the same exact thing. Genesis talks about a pantheon of gods also. There's not just one God, the way you want everyone to think. We can delve into that. But it clearly talks about how Yahweh is just one God. he's the Israelites' God, and these other nations had other gods, and those gods were warring with each other. And then the Bible tries to make the case that Yahweh was the strongest of those gods. And you see the birth of monotheism throughout the Old Testament. There's a lot of writing on this. A lot of scholars have written on this, but it's pretty clear that the earliest writing and the earliest belief system was not at all that there was only one God. There were a whole host of gods in that area, and monotheism was born out of that.
And we talked about that too, I think, when we were talking about 2 Peter, because I think there's references in that letter to the skies and as being angelic beings or something like that.
Yes, absolutely.
So this was just the sort of baseline belief.
Like, his point is kind of like I don't want to.
He's doing
put words in his mouth.
apologetics and not scholarship. Like,
right.
These are clearly related ideas. Like, they're all coming from the same part of the world. These cultures are intermixing. Like, the ideas don't just stay in a... And we ultimately believe that there are no actual gods in any of these cultures.
Right. But, I mean, his point is all these other cultures had all these weird and wacky mythological ideas. But then the Bible was written, and it was this bold, fresh thing that was totally subverted all that, and it was all new. None of that is true. All of these stories in the Old Testament are retellings of other stories. Everybody knows that. It's frustrating to me. His take on it is just so misleading to people that don't know better. They should know. No, like the Noah story, Abraham and Isaac, the creation account, the Tower of Babel. Every major story in the Old Testament, other versions of that can be found in cultures in the same region. So don't come on his show and tell everybody that this is all some kind of novel thing that no one else had ever seen before. And that's why it must be true, because all these other things were wacky and weird. But then this new, fresh thing, that's just not true.
Yeah, if I was on the show, I would take this opportunity to talk about the idea of the documentary hypothesis and how there's a editor that's putting these texts together, these sources that we find,
the J source, etc.
Maybe smaller scraps of older material, various material, and crafting it in a way that is at one time during the Babylonian captivity and during the Assyrian captivity. So some of it is influenced by those cultural motifs, some of it is critical of those cultural motifs, and it encounters older myths and older material and borrows from sources that may or may not have been, like, or the Book of Wars. It's much more complicated, and there was an editorial process. But Wes is reading Genesis from a evangelical Christian perspective. Even talking about the Imago Dei, that's not a Hebrew term. I think is more conceptual than... Obviously, we're made in the image of God in Genesis, but I think we've talked about it before. Like, I think that does mean, in a wooden sense, that we look like God looks, like we have a body like God did.
Absolutely.
He came and walked with Adam in the garden.
That's a big misconception that a lot of people have. The words actually mean God made us to look the way God looked visually, and it makes sense because God, if you read in Genesis the way he's described as a human being, he's walking around, he's having conversation, he has hands, he has a back, he sits on a throne. That's the way God was envisioned. And now modern Christians say, no, I remember in the Catechism, God is a spirit and does not have a body like man. That's what we learned. And he's omnipresent. He's everywhere at once. He's this eternal entity. That's not at all the conception of God in the Old Testament. And so now we reinterpret it to say, oh, in the image of God, it's like almost like this poetic language that says we have a piece of God's spirit on us, or however they want to interpret that. But that's not really what the words mean. That kind of mistake happens a lot, where another one that comes to mind is the firmament. We talk about this a lot on this show, but it very clearly says in Genesis that there's a dome over the earth, and it's a dome that holds back the water. They viewed the earth as being flat with a dome over it and holds the water back. And there's actually like pillars and things, and it sounds crazy to us because we are familiar with modern cosmology and a spherical earth rotating around the sun. But they didn't know that. No, and it's not just the people that wrote the Bible. Every culture in that area viewed the cosmology as that. So now when Christians talk about the firmament, they're like, the expanse of the heavens, almost like this poetic language. No, it's talking about like an actual object that was up in the sky, holding everything back. So Christians do that a lot now. They reinterpret the Bible based on what we now know about the universe to make it fit in better. But I digress.
I think it's a big problem from my perspective for Christianity that when the text is written, it's written in a very specific way, based on the idea that the author had. So if you separate Paul from Paul's idea of what the heavens were like, or Paul's idea of what happens to you at death, a lot of Christian beliefs come from Paul's ideas about what happened to you at death, or Paul's like apocalyptic cosmology. So how much of that is just borrowed from his Greek surroundings and some of his educational influences? And if that's the case, then everything is just reinterpreted over and over throughout history till William Lane Craig comes out with a book where he's saying something completely different than Paul is actually saying, reading into Paul.
Right.
In between those, there's 1,000 other interpretations of Paul through various periods of time. If you want to understand Imago Dei the way the church right now understands it, then what Wes is doing is fine. But if you want to understand what the author, the editor who composed the text, the potential readers in the 6th century, the readers in the 1st century CE, if you want to know what those people think, you have to resist the urge to read it super theologically the way Wes is reading it, because you have all those expectations already built in.
Right.
And so I think it's just, if all you want to get from the text is a sort of reaffirmation of what you already think about the text, then what Wes is doing is fine. But if you want to actually explore what the text could be saying beyond your immediate expectations, it's not a good way to read. He's reading into the text.
Yeah, but maybe I'm saying it too simply, but he's just getting it wrong.
Yeah.
That's not what the text is saying. So if you want to get closer to what the text is actually saying, don't listen to Wes Huff.
Yeah, but I think that they would have to make the case that we've had 2,000 years of theological reflection on the text so that we actually do know better than what the author was writing at that time. I think that's nonsensical.
If you're saying, yeah, the author thought X, Y, and Z, because that's what everyone in that era thought, but now we can look at it and interpret the text differently because of what we now know. Okay, that's one way to present it. I'm not saying I agree with it, but at least come out and admit that. The problem is he's presenting it as if what his current belief system is exactly what the author was also saying. And that's a big problem for me because that is clearly refuted by the evidence.
Yeah, and using it to contrast the larger environment of religious belief that the Genesis story sort of is engendered by saying, we got it right and we're the only ones that affirm these positive things, and these other ones are all crap.
Yeah, it's really insulting, and you're taking the book out of the context of the cultures that it was written in, where all these cultures were writing their own mythologies, and you're basically saying all of that was shit, but this one was the real one, and it's so different. You know, one thing I've realized, anybody that's religious understands that there are many other religions and belief systems out there, and I think that there's a certain something that's uncomfortable about that to them, because all religions seem to have the desire to promote the uniqueness of their own. Like growing up in the church, it was a big thing for Christians to always talk about no other religion has this, whatever it is, the need for a savior. And then I was at a barber, and he was Jewish. He had like the Rabbi Schneerson picture on the wall, so I was asking him about like what his views are of that. It was really interesting. He really got into the details. He wasn't trying to convert me to Judaism, but what he was doing was really telling me how it's unique. No other religion has this, that, and the other thing. And he had all these points and reasons. And it just struck me, that seems to be a ubiquitous thing among religions, that it's really important for the devotees of that religion to understand that theirs must be the true one because it's the only one that teaches X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, it's true. Even religions that are less explicit in their exclusivity are still want to be seen as unique.
I think at a core level they understand the logic that, wait a second, the true religion would have something about it that's unique. So if you're able to show all these religions are just derivative of each other, I think it would kind of cut against the truth of any of them. So I think there's like a natural impulse to get away from that and be like, all these others are such and such, but this one stands out for these reasons. That's like a point that you hear a lot. Definitely within Christianity.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think it's an unconscious reaction to a recognition that they all do share basically the same, like not in a Carl Jungian type way where they're all tapped into the same spiritual substance and like just interpreted in their different cultural ways. I just think that religion fulfills certain things that humanity desires and maybe is never really been able to rely on as in a self-grounded way, like meaning or ritual or community, or they express some sort of social antagonism that not resolved. I think they are the same. I think they arise out of the same sort of historical substance. And a lot of the practices are just the same too. Even across really distant cultures, there's very similar practices. So I think we talked about it relatively recently when we talked about the comparisons between Christianity and Mormonism or Christianity and Islam. Christians are super highly critical of Islam or Mormonism, as like they should be, right? Everyone should be critical of religion and make sure that like they're not just believing like nonsense.
Right. They put
that
blinders
same
on.
lens back on your
Right.
own faith.
Exactly.
That's just the whole thing of what Wes is doing. This is just apologetics 101.
I'm not enough of an expert on religions to do this, but I'm sure if you gave me enough time, I could come up with something unique in every religion that you could claim, like, oh, well, like only in Buddhism is there such and such. Again, none of that actually makes it true. I think, though, that I think I may have said this in the podcast before, but there are things that would, and I don't want to say convert me, but really get my attention. Like if, for instance, in the Old Testament, it talked about vaccines, or if Jesus talked about things that science had not yet developed, or things about the universe that we didn't know until the James Webb Telescope or the Hubble Telescope. It's like, oh, wow, there's clearly some kind of insight here that they had that they couldn't have possibly known. But I'm yet to actually find anything like that. It just seems to me like anything they talk about scientifically goes completely right along with what was believed at that time in that area, in that culture, by everybody, Jews and non-Jews alike. So if they could show me that, I think it would be striking. If, for instance, if they found Noah's Ark, I don't know what I would say, Ben, if they actually went up on a mountain and actually found a huge boat that fits the description in Genesis, where the wood could be dated back to that time. It's on top of a mountain. that would mean something to me. I'd be like, well, I don't know how to explain that. But they haven't found that, and they're not going to find that because there's no boat on top of a mountain.
John, this is your lucky day. Because they just found Noah's Ark.
Nice.
Now, I did actually see that on Twitter, but I'm skeptical. I think it was just the same rock formation that they've been I've seen
these
for
articles
40
my whole
years
life.
now.
My whole life, I've seen these claims, articles, books. Seriously, I feel like it's every few months you get another headline like Noah's Ark found.
The funniest thing about the rock formations is there's like another one that's shaped the same way, like right next to it. So it's like, what is it, 2 arcs up there?
Actually, it's not just 2. There's that whole area, if it's what you're talking about, and I think it is. It's just the topography of the area. If you look at like satellite imagery, like those type of formations are all over the place. No boat. The whole idea of it is ridiculous.
The Skeptics Bible Project is a John and Ben production, with intro music by John Lobker. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project, and follow us on all social media platforms at Skeptics Project. Got questions or comments? Email us at skepticsbibleproject@gmail.com.